Well, welcome to iOS versus Android development. Today we're talking about networking, basically how to get JSON data from the internet into our iOS and Android applications. And we'll use URL session in iOS and an HTTP URL connection in Android. So I found some sample JSON data online. You can see it has a bunch of items, we'll call them posts, with a user ID, an ID, a title, and a body. You can also see that it has some missing data. So how can we get this data into our app? We'll start with iOS. First, we're going to need an object model that matches the JSON. So in Swift, we'll set up a struct called post and give it the same properties as the JSON. And we'll make them optional so that when the data is missing, they'll be set to nil. And I already have a UI table view controller set up. This is how we'll eventually display the data. But we're going to get our data using a separate class called networking client. So let's declare a function called getPosts in the networking client. Before we forget, let's call it in viewDidLoad of our post view controller. So the first thing we'll do in our getPosts method is create a complete URL string from our base URL and post string. Then we can create a URL object from the URL string. If this string doesn't make a valid URL, then we'll just print bad URL. If it is a good URL though, we'll set up a URL session and pass in the URL. When URL session is done, it'll send back data, response, and error. And to get this to actually run, we'll add .resume. It's important to note that URL session will automatically perform this on a background thread so that our UI doesn't get stuck waiting for a response. So when we do get something back, first we'll check if there's an error. If there is, we'll print it. Then we'll check if the status code of the response is 200. If not, we'll print the response description. Then we'll see if we have data. If we do, we'll try to decode it using JSON decoder's decode method. We'll pass in our object model and the data. Then we can print our posts. If we don't have data, then we'll print the error thrown by the decoder. Note, however, in order for this to work, our post object model needs to conform to the decodable protocol, so we'll add that too. And since we're already calling getPost from viewDidLoad, our post should print if we run it, so let's try it out. And sure enough, our posts do print, so now we have data from the internet in a usable format. So how can we do the same thing in Android? First, we'll need our post model object. We'll define its properties, add a constructor, and add some getters to get the title and body, which we'll need for when we actually display the data in a recycler view. Then in the networking client, I've already added a function that will set up an HTTP URL connection and get data back in the form of an input stream. I also already have two functions that will convert that string that is returned into an array of JSON objects. First, the string is converted to a JSON array. Then a JSON object is created for each element in that array and put in its own JSON object array. And these functions will come in handy later. So now we can set up our getPost function. And before I forget, let's call that in our activities onCreate method. The first step is to create our URL, and this needs to be wrapped in a try-catch block in order to handle a malformed URL exception. And now we should set up an async task. I'll call it getPost async task. And we'll implement the doInBackground method. And we need to do this because, as I mentioned before, network requests need to be done in the background so that our UI doesn't get stuck waiting. Then we'll also implement the onPostExecute method. And now that we have that set up, we can create a getPost async task and execute it using the URL we created. Then in doInBackground, we'll call getResponse from HTTP URL in a try-catch block. We'll then create a JSON object array from this response string, create a new post object for each element in that array, and we'll print the posts. So just like in iOS, we now have data from the internet in a usable format. So which one's better? If we're answering this question without considering third-party libraries, I'd have to say iOS wins this one. The JSON decoder that's available in Swift 4 is pretty nifty. But let me know if you disagree in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.